There was a moment in history when justice became a spectacle, a moment when death stopped being a punishment and became a public performance. Imagine children eating sweets while a sharp blade slices off a head, couples holding hands as a body still trembles, mothers, merchants, and drunkards celebrating each execution like it was a festival. This scene isn't an exaggeration. It was the reality of an entire country that turned death into routine. And it all began with one man. April 25th, 1792. France. A man named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier is escorted from his cell to a wooden structure set up outside the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. His crime, robbery with murder. His sentence, decapitation. But he wouldn't die by sword. Not by axe. No, his death will be different. Precise, silent, and brutally modern. That day, for the first time, a machine was used that promised something impossible. To kill without pain. To cut without mistakes. To execute without dirtying anyone's hands. No one knew it yet, but that moment wasn't just the end of a criminal. It was the beginning of a new order. One where justice would be swift, exact, and deadly. It was the birth of the guillotine. To understand how an entire society not only accepted, but applauded the ruthless drop of a blade onto human flesh, we need to go back 35 years earlier. France, 1757. King Louis XV rules with absolute authority, while the people boil with discontent. That year, a man, Robert Francois Damiens, attempts to assassinate the king with a simple pocket knife. He fails, but his act unleashes a reaction so savage, so meticulously inhuman, that it leaves a scar not only on France, but across all of Europe. Damiens is tied to a wooden cross. His hand is burned with molten lead. Chunks of flesh are torn off with red-hot pincers. Boiling liquids poured into his open wounds. And when you think nothing worse can happen, they tie his limbs to 4 horses and force them to run in opposite directions. His body doesn't tear apart. Tendons must be cut, muscles ripped, bones broken, until the torso finally separates. And while he's still breathing, still twitching, they throw him into the fire. That wasn't justice. It was torture turned into theater. And the most disturbing part, it was public. Dozens, maybe hundreds, watched without looking away. Some clapped, others ate. The point wasn't the law. It was the message. This is what happens when you challenge power. But that spectacle left scars, not just on Damien's body, but on Europe's collective conscience. Philosophers like Voltaire and Beccaria began to ask, what's the point of burning a man to ashes if all that's left is a more cruel society? What if punishment by violence doesn't protect order, but corrupts it? Decades later, those questions would explode, not in books or cafes, but in streets, palaces, and public squares. The French Revolution, a political and social earthquake that promised liberty, equality, fraternity, also brought with it a new way of seeing death. In 1791, the National Assembly decreed something radical. All executions must be carried out without unnecessary suffering. Punishment should not cause pain. Death must be, paradoxically, more humane. But there was a problem. How do you kill without pain? Swords were slow, axes imprecise, and executioners, human. They hesitated. They failed. Sometimes it took 3 strikes to sever a single head. It was humiliating, inefficient, and, for the new republic, unacceptable. They needed something new, something that wouldn't shake, wouldn't think, wouldn't feel compassion. A tool of justice that was mechanical, exact, and unrelenting. Enter Joseph Ignace Guillotine, doctor, scientist, an advocate for painless death. His idea was simple and terrifying. Create a device that executes everyone equally. No mistakes, no suffering, no room for error. At first, they laughed at him, mocked him for wanting to turn death into a technical matter. But slowly, his cold logic became a virtue. In a collapsing world, the only thing that seemed to make sense was precision. The assembly had the idea, but not the design. So they turned to the only expert in executions who could deliver results. Charles-Henri Sanson, official executioner of the realm. At 18, he had already helped dismember Damiens. Sanson knew something the politicians didn't. The human arm trembles. The mind hesitates. But steel doesn't. He wasn't seeking compassion. He wanted efficiency. The design was handed to Dr. Antoine Louis, who, along with German craftsman Tobias Schmidt, built the first prototype. A wooden frame, a heavy blade, triangular and slanted, a weight-based mechanism. They tested it on animals, then on corpses. It worked. The blade fell with surgical speed, separating head from body in a fraction of a second. No mistakes, no screams, no error. Death had become technical, silent, precise. And even if that coldness was terrifying, it was exactly what they wanted. An execution without hesitation, without emotion. The irony was brutal. What started as a joke, just a name people tossed around, became the most serious and feared symbol of the new power. The blade was no longer an idea. It had a name, a form, and a relentless purpose. April 25th, 1792. Nicolas Jacques Pelletier becomes the first. They bring him to the machine, strap him to the plank, lock his neck in place. The executioner pulls the lever, and then the blade falls. Fast, final, as if time itself had been cut in two. The head rolls into the basket. The body twitches. Then, silence. The world had just witnessed something new. A death without doubt, without tremor. But the most chilling part wasn't the cut. It was the reaction. The crowd protested. They shouted, "We want the gallows. We want screams. We want blood." That death was too fast, too clean, too disappointing. And that, my friends, wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Because what no one suspected that day was that the efficiency of that blade had opened a door that would never close, a door to a new kind of terror, organized, legal, routine. But what came next will leave you speechless, because the guillotine didn't stay in just one square or one revolution. It became a death factory, and what followed wasn't justice, it was machinery. In the following months, the guillotine never rested. Week after week, new convictions, new heads, new baskets filled. What was once an extraordinary event began to feel like a repeated scene. The device became part of the landscape, like a tree in the square or a fountain in the market. Always there, always ready, always sharp. Executions began to be announced in advance. Pamphlets were printed with the names of the condemned. Some included times, others illustrations. Executions were no longer state secrets. They were public agendas. And the people reacted as they do to any show, with enthusiasm. Families went out early to get a good spot. They brought chairs, lunches. They brought their children. Some even sold special lenses to not miss a single detail. There was wine, music, jokes. Executions became a daily ritual. A new, fresh, revolutionary tradition. One in which death wasn't a tragedy, it was routine. And when death becomes a habit, it no longer matters who it touches. At first, it was aristocrats, enemies of the people, traitors. Then it was merchants. Then dissident revolutionaries. Later, poets. And one day, without warning, it was the very people who had designed the machine, who had defended it, who had applauded its birth. No one was safe. Danton, one of the fathers of the revolution, ended up under the guillotine. Desmoulins, another great orator of the change too. And Robespierre, the architect of terror, the man who signed death sentences daily, ended up like so many others, beneath the very blade he had helped to raise. The streets no longer asked if someone deserved to die. They asked when. Names were whispered in fear. One wrong word, one raised eyebrow at the wrong moment, one misunderstood silence. Any gesture could be read as treason, and treason meant sentence, and sentence meant the blade. It was the revolution devouring its own children. Between 1793 and 1794, France lived through the darkest period of its modern history. The terror. During those months, the guillotine didn't stop for a single day. On particularly busy days, between 20 and 50 people were executed, one after another, an endless line of bodies and heads. A repeated, precise, cold spectacle. Some days, blood flowed down the cobbled streets like a red stream. Food vendors near the scaffold had to build wooden platforms to avoid stepping into the puddle that formed. The smell was so strong some carried perfumed handkerchiefs. Others had simply gotten used to it. And that was the most disturbing part. The habit. The guillotine, which had been born as a humanitarian solution, had become an industrial killing machine. Just another cog in the state. An assembly line where each fallen body was just another closed case. No tears, no pause, no moral judgment, just levers pulled, blades falling, and heads disappearing. And just when everything seemed efficient, something unexpected brought fear back. Because someone noticed a small, chilling, terrifying detail. The heads didn't die instantly. Doctors studying decapitated bodies began to record movements, blinks, spasms. In some cases, the eyes remained open. They looked, focused, blinked. One doctor, Samuel Thomas von Sommering, wrote in 1795 that some faces pressed their lips or moved their eyes as if still present, as if they still knew, as if they still felt. The idea that a head, separated from its body, might retain consciousness for a few seconds froze many. Were they suffering? Were they aware of their own decapitation? Did they feel the baskets cold? Did they hear the crowd screams? There was no definitive proof, but there was no comfort either, because the guillotine had been sold as a clean death, instant, painless. And if that wasn't true, then the entire system that backed it was shaking. Doubt began to spread like a disease, and each new execution carried an unanswered question. Are we killing quickly or torturing silently? Some witnesses claimed that Charlotte Corday's head blushed when slapped by her executioner. Others said poet André Chenier murmured verses when he no longer had a body, that he looked to the sky as blood poured over the wood. No one could confirm anything, but everyone feared it. The guillotine kept falling, but its prestige began to rust. It was no longer a symbol of modernity or equality. It was a shadow looming over every citizen, a reminder that the state could kill you without blinking. And once the blade was raised, there was no turning back. And yet, the most disturbing part is this. The guillotine didn't disappear after the terror. It didn't stop when Robespierre fell. It wasn't shelved like a relic. No, it stayed. It persisted. It was used, year after year, government after government, revolution after revolution. Back after the terror, many believed the guillotine would be archived, that it would disappear along with the excesses, that it would remain a symbol of a savage era France would never return to. But that didn't happen. The machine survived, not as an emblem, not as a hero. It survived the way useful tools do, silently, without asking permission, without disappearing. During the 19th century, the guillotine remained active, discreet, silent, lethal. It was no longer set up in the main square. Now it was hidden away, in enclosed courtyards, in prisons far from the center. But it was still there. In every new regime, in every new republic, with every monarchy restored, the blade kept falling. Sometimes for serious crimes, sometimes not so serious, sometimes with witnesses, sometimes alone, as if the entire country had decided to look the other way. There were no more crowds, no pamphlets with names, no children with sweets in hand. Now, only an executioner, one or two officials, and the condemned. Justice had changed its clothes, but not its methods. In those years, executions by guillotine began to feel more like paperwork than punishment. Thieves, murderers, traitors were executed. Defenseless poor people, truly guilty, and victims of judicial chance. But the blade didn't ask. The blade only obeyed. And here lies the most unsettling part. As the guillotine became more routine, more hidden, more institutionalized, it also became untouchable. No government wanted to get rid of it completely. Some used it enthusiastically, others quietly, but all kept it, like an awkward relic that couldn't be thrown away, but also couldn't be displayed. A functional shame, a ghost with an edge. The people no longer cheered, but neither did they protest, as if everyone had accepted that death, as long as it was quiet, was allowed. And so, without making noise, the guillotine reached the 20th century. A new century, new technologies, new wars, new ideologies. But in France, at least in the shadows of its penal system, death still had the same shape as always: wood, iron, and a sharp triangular blade. The contrast was grotesque. Movies were now in color. Cars sped down highways. Radios played love songs. The Eiffel Tower stood tall over Paris as a symbol of modernity. And yet, in a dark corner of some prison, there was still a wooden structure waiting its turn. A tense rope, a trained executioner, a trembling prisoner. and the silence just before the strike. One of the voices that dared to speak out was philosopher Albert Camus. In 1957, he wrote one of the most devastating essays on the guillotine in modern times. His critique wasn't about death. It was about what the machine took away: hope. He said that someone sentenced to hang might pray for the rope to break, that someone before a firing squad might dream of a last-minute pardon. But before the guillotine, there was no room for miracles. It was a perfect machine, precise, unfailing. The condemned didn't think about their soul. They thought about the blade, about whether it would fall cleanly, whether it would hurt, whether they'd still be conscious. A brutal question. Will the machine work properly? And the answer is always yes. That was the problem. Because history may forgive cruelty, it may explain violence, but it never forgets what turns death into routine. And that's what the guillotine became in France. A routine dressed up as law. A murder turned into administration. A repeated cut without emotion, without judgment, without memory. For more than 180 years, the blade fell without interruption. And when the final execution came, the world was no longer the same. It was 1977. Disco music ruled the radio. Technicolor movies lit up the screens. Europe spoke of democracy, human rights, liberty. But at 4:40 in the morning, in a prison in Marseille, the guillotine fell for the last time. The name of the condemned was Hamida Jandoubi, a Tunisian immigrant convicted of murder. His crime was brutal, his trial quick, his fate sealed. He was beheaded in the early hours. There was no crowd, no screams, just a couple of legal witnesses, a professional executioner, and a blade performing its duty for the very last time. The blood didn't splash across a plaza. It fell on a cold prison floor. And in absolute silence, an era ended. But that execution wasn't the real ending. It was the final question. France, the birthplace of the rights of man, had to look in the mirror and ask itself, how did we get here? How is it possible that in the 20th century, while the world marched toward the future, we were still using a device born in the darkest days of our past? There was no easy answer, because the guillotine wasn't just a machine. It was an idea, a promise, a shortcut. It represented justice without mistakes, equality without exceptions, death without suffering. At least, that was the official story. But in reality, it was a trap. Its efficiency let us ignore the pain. Its precision let us forget the process. And its coldness hid the essential truth. Behind every execution was a human story. Unique, irreplaceable, sometimes just, sometimes not, but always final. After the execution of Hamida Jandoubi in 1977, France went silent. There were no euphoric statements, no official speeches, just an administrative closure, a completed procedure. But that final decapitation wasn't just another execution. It was the last heartbeat of a machine that had worked for nearly 2 centuries. And even though the blade stopped falling, its edge remained present in the country's conscience. Bit by bit, debate became inevitable. Journalists, philosophers, activists, everyday citizens, all began to ask the same question. Why, in the late 20th century, were we still using an 18th century killing machine? Why would a country that had taught the world the meaning of liberty still execute people as if it were living in Robespierre's time? The system had no clear answers. For years, the guillotine had worked in the shadows, like an open secret, a fast, silent, complication-free solution. But now, with the world watching, France could no longer hide it, nor justify it. The pressure increased, from inside and out. And finally, in 1981, under the government of François Mitterrand, France took a step many thought impossible. The death penalty was abolished. By law. For good. The device was removed, dismantled, archived, as if it were a museum piece. But it wasn't just wood and steel being stored in state warehouses. It was a symbol, an echo, the ghost of something far deeper. Because even though heads no longer rolled, the image of the guillotine remained in the collective memory. In cartoons, in books, in family stories, in inherited nightmares. It had stopped being a machine and had become a national myth. A reminder of what happens when justice stops being human and becomes mechanical. And the most unsettling part, the guillotine was never just a French invention. Its shadow extended much further. In every corner of the world where public executions are held, In every country that still broadcasts death as entertainment. In every place where the law becomes a theatrical act of punishment. There, no matter the form, the guillotine still lives. No longer with a blade. No longer made of wood, but alive. Because the true guillotine was never the object. It was the idea. The principle that death can be organized, systematized, justified. The illusion that punishment, if quick and clean, doesn't need to be questioned. And today, that logic still exists. Just look around. At lynchings filmed on phones. At instant social condemnation online. At media trials, delivered with hate and without context. The blade has changed shape, but still falls. We live surrounded by new guillotines. Digital, moral, legal, and the most alarming thing, we've gotten used to them. Because the real tragedy isn't that a society invented a machine to kill. The tragedy is that society learned to see death as routine, as something necessary, as paperwork. And when that happens, when we stop seeing the person and only see a file, a number, the guilty one, it doesn't matter if the blade is steel or a tweet. It doesn't matter if there's a rope or a camera. It doesn't matter if the executioner wears black or a judge's robe. The result is the same. Someone is reduced to nothing, to meat, to silence. The hardest thing to accept is that maybe we learn nothing. We keep looking for ways to punish fast, to judge without nuance, to turn pain into content, to applaud when someone falls, even if we don't know who they were or why they were there. And all of that feels far too close to the squares of the 18th century. So when we talk about the guillotine, we're not just talking about the past. We're talking about ourselves, about what we're willing to justify when fear enters the room, about what we accept in the name of order, of justice, of security. The guillotine was a brilliant invention in its logic and design, but it was also a warning, an ethical trap, a test of whether progress, without humanity, can become more deadly than any blade. And that's the great irony, that the machine that promised painless justice ended up representing the total coldness of a system that stopped looking its condemned in the eyes. The guillotine was retired, its pieces restored, its blueprints archived, its story treated as a closed chapter. But some things aren't so easy to store away, because even if the blade no longer cuts, even if the lever is no longer pulled, even if the frame is covered in dust, the true edge was never metal. It was symbolic, and that remains as sharp as ever. Every time a society decides to punish without thinking, every time hate wins over judgment, every time the system forgets that behind every sentence, there is a life, the guillotine comes back, in the form of revenge, in the form of a media trial, in the form of a click, of public shaming, of silence in the face of injustice, of spectacle, because that's what the guillotine was in the end. A show of absolute power disguised as law. A stage where bodies fell and the crowd applauded. And when applause becomes a habit, death stops hurting. And that is the most dangerous thing of all. That's why this story isn't told to entertain. It's told to remember, to disturb, to understand what happens when we stop asking questions. Because where there was once a head, there was a life. And where there was a life, there was a story worth hearing. If you made it this far, it's not by accident. Something brought you here. A curiosity, a doubt, a sense of discomfort. And that's good, because memory isn't built with data. It's built with voices, with stories, with accounts that must not be forgotten. So tell us in the comments, do you think the guillotine was a more just way to execute, or just a modern mask for the same old barbarism? And if this story made you think, if something inside you moved, subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with someone else. Not to boost numbers, but to keep uncovering the stories others would rather leave buried. Because where there was once a machine, there was an idea, and ideas, for better or worse, live on. We'll see you in the next story. As a machine that kills efficiently, always find someone willing to use it.